This episode is brought to you by Hired.com. Searching for a new job can feel stressful, scary, and time-consuming. Pushy recruiters try to sell you on roles that you don't actually want, and job boards make you feel like you're throwing your resume into a black hole, never to be seen again. Sometimes you go all the way through an interview process just to find out at the very end that the salary offer or company culture doesn't match what you're looking for. Hired is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities in engineering, development, design, product management, data science, sales, and marketing. We make your job search faster, focused, and stress-free. Instead of endlessly applying to companies and hoping for the best, Hired puts you in control of when and how you connect with compelling new opportunities. After completing one simple application, top employers apply to hire you. On Hired, you receive personalized interview requests and upfront salary information so you can make informed decisions about which opportunities to pursue over a condensed timeline. Throughout the process, your dedicated talent advocate will have your back, providing unbiased career coaching to help you put your best foot forward with potential employers. Hired offers access to 4,000 plus innovative employers, including big brands such as Facebook and smaller emerging startups. The size and type of company you want to connect with is totally up to you. We help people find new opportunities in 17 major cities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Open to relocation? Let us know. Your privacy and autonomy in your job search is of utmost importance to us. That's why Hired hides your profile from your current and past employers. The best part is it's always free for you to find your next job on Hired, no exceptions. We pay you to get hired. Today's listeners can earn double our normal $1,000 hiring bonus by signing up with the show's link. That's right, earn $2,000 for finding your next chapter on Hired. Visit hired.com/React Native Radio to learn more. This episode is brought to you by dailydrip.com. Daily Drip makes keeping up to date on programming skills easier. You already know how much time it takes to find good resources and learn new languages. What if the hard part of that was already done for you? Sign up for Daily Drip and pick a topic that you want to learn about. Want to learn React Native? How about Elm? Maybe you want to brush up on your CSS and HTML. Every weekday, you'll get a short video or reading delivered to you via email. The best part is it only takes 5 minutes a day. We have a special coupon code just for React Native Radio listeners. If you sign up using the coupon code RNRadio, all one word, you'll save $9 on your first month, which means you can try out the React Native topic for free. Don't forget to use the coupon code RNRadio to show support for our podcast. Make learning part of your daily routine with dailydrip.com. Hello and welcome to episode 54 of React Native Radio. Today on our panel, we have Peter Pikarczyk.
Hey, everybody.
Gant Laborde.
Hello, friends.
I'm Nader Dabbit. And today, as our special guest, we have TJ VanToll of the NativeScript project. Hello, TJ, and welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I know we had you on about a year and a half ago, maybe when we first started the show, really. You were one of our first guests, and we were kind of talking about the differences at the time between React Native and NativeScript, and we went over a lot of things. So we'll kind of be doing a revamp of that episode, kind of getting up to speed where the project is, where it's gone over the last 18 months or so. And just kind of everything having to do with NativeScript, but also maybe Angular 2, now that Angular 2 is stable. And I'm sure that this all kind of ties together, I know, with Angular 2. But I think I also understand maybe you can use NativeScript without Angular. But I guess that's a question for later on. But I guess before we kind of get into the topic, can you kind of give everyone a brief overview about yourself and kind of how you got into programming?
Yeah, so I've been developing for about 10 years now, and I've sort of done a little bit of everything, but most of that time was spent on web development. And a few years ago, I found myself getting into the mobile world, basically as mobile started to get more popular, which sort of led to my involvement in the hybrid space, so sort of the Cordova and PhoneGap world, which sort of led logically here in the last couple of years into technologies like React Native and NativeScript. And I've been involved with the NativeScript project specifically for, it's basically 2 full years at this point. So for quite a while now, and that's basically what I do day in, day out at this point.
So can you tell everyone listening what NativeScript is, how it came about, and what it kind of is accomplishing and what its aim is to accomplish?
Yeah, so the company I work for is Progress Software, and you might notice I previously worked for Telerik, and we were acquired by Progress, so we kind of all fall under the Progress umbrella. But sort of regardless of the name, our companies had a fairly long history of working in the Cordova space. So we maintain what is really I think it's the second largest listing of Cordova plugins out there behind Cordova's own site. We build tools for Cordova. We've been in that space for quite a long time. And over the years, we sort of found that technology stack wasn't enough to meet a lot of our users and our customers' needs. And so we got requests over and over again that people wanted more speed out of Cordova. They wanted more native integration. They just really wanted to push the technology stack because it wasn't meeting the needs. It wasn't meeting the requirements of the apps that they needed to build. And NativeScript really came out of that. And at first, NativeScript's aim was to sort of take Cordova and make up for the things that we had seen through our usage just wasn't quite there. And so one of those things is performance. So NativeScript, like React Native, is using completely native user interfaces. So we do not use a web view. We do not use the DOM. We do not use HTML. We are building native UI components. The other big thing behind our technology was we wanted to make it easier for developers to hit native iOS and Android APIs, hit native hardware features, because that's something that we saw was very hard to do in Cordova. You can write Cordova, you can write PhoneGap plugins, but it tends to be fairly tedious to do so. It's not an easy thing that you spin up. So with NativeScript, we wanted to make that very easy to do. So really, we try to make it easy to use NativeScript if you have or if you come from a web development background. And so in NativeScript, you write your code using either JavaScript or TypeScript. We support both. You use a subset of CSS to style your apps, much like React Native does as well. And really out of the box, that's all you need to know. Now, there's some other things that you could know that certainly helps. Certainly having some existing iOS and Android experience will help you out because even if you come from a web development background, being familiar with some of these native concepts is beneficial. And there are certain things that you just can't get around just needing to do, whether you're using React Native or NativeScript. I mean, things like putting your apps out to the stores, creating splash screens, creating icons, permissions, these sorts of things that we certainly try to help you learn with NativeScript, but certainly having some existing background would help. But at a bare minimum, it's a basic JavaScript and CSS skills should be all you need to just get started with the basics.
So when it comes to styling your CSS, do you kind of take the same position React Native does, where it's very similar to the DOM, but a lot of those elements aren't there yet? Or do you take a different approach?
So I'm not totally familiar with React Native's approach. I only know it at a pretty high level, but I can tell you more or less how NativeScript works. Essentially, we're using CSS in the sense that we're using the language, the semantics. You create selectors with name value pairs. And essentially what we do is we parse that CSS file at runtime and apply those name value pairs. So, I think one big difference between how NativeScript operates in React Native, or really this is more of just a React framework, not necessarily React Native, is that with NativeScript, you are putting your CSS in external files, much like you would probably do on the web, that we parse and then apply those name value pairs. So we do use, of course, a subset of CSS. It's not like every CSS property and every CSS rule that's available on the web is going to work in NativeScript, but we make the subset of things that we can apply to native elements work. And I guess to get at your question too, you can apply rules for elements that don't quite exist. So when you add a new UI component to the visual tree in NativeScript, we will sort of do a lookup of all the existing CSS rules and apply that to the native element when it comes into existence.
In comparison, how would you describe the code reusability for NativeScript across platforms?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. And it's something that, I guess one thing we can get into, and this was brought up earlier, was NativeScript, using it with Angular and using it without Angular. And to answer that question asked earlier, you can use NativeScript sort of in either situation. You can use NativeScript just with vanilla JavaScript. You can use NativeScript with TypeScript. You can use NativeScript with Angular as well. So you have some options. And sort of regardless of where or sort of how you choose to architect your app sort of affects the answer to how much code that you can reuse. What we found is that really, especially using NativeScript with Angular is where the real code reuse story comes into play. And I'm sort of wondering, after I finish here, I'm curious if the same is true with React and React Native. And I say that because even though you can absolutely share JavaScript code between your NativeScript JavaScript app and, say, your web app, when you're coding to Angular's API, it just sort of lends itself really well to that code sharing situation, just because the Angular framework makes it easy to isolate. This is the part of my code. This is the component that actually deals with the user interface. So that portion I'm going to have to rewrite. I'm going to have to write it once for the web. I'm going to have to write it once for my native app. But when you've sort of isolated the UI in sort of its own place, it makes it a lot easier to say, I'm going to write this service that has nothing to do with a user interface and that just say, maybe hits my backend for some data or maybe does some formatting or whatever the case may be, and to sort of segregate that stuff off so that you can use it across the web and across native apps. Now, the one sort of challenge with that, and something that we're actually sort of thinking about and wondering about right now, is the actual specifics of how you share your code. So just because you can segment your code off, then it becomes, do you build, say, your web app and your native app from a single code base and sort of write your own little CLI helpers to sort of make that happen? Or do you set up two separate code bases and maybe share a private NPM package between the two, or just even manually copy and paste code? And so that's the sort of thing that we've been doing a lot of thinking about lately and trying to come up with some workflows and recommendations and working with our community to see what we could do for that sort of thing. So I'm actually somewhat curious how the same sort of thing works in React Native because I'm not super familiar.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that kind of tying in with this, it sounds like you're a bit more, you have a lot of Angular experience. Is that right?
Maybe not a lot. I have some.
Yeah. So Angular has been for a while infamous for having that sort of hockey stick growth pattern where you're like, I know what I'm doing. And then for a long time, I have no clue what I'm doing. And then you get to another point where you know what you're doing again. Do you find that is this problem magnified by tying it in with what's going on here? Or do you think that it's just sort of that problem is independent of NativeScript, and that if you've solved it in web, you've kind of solved it there as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is one thing that we struggle with too, because learning Angular, I mean, say what you will about Angular or even React for that matter, but there is quite a learning curve to getting up to speed with not just knowing the syntaxes, but knowing how to use them to successfully build an app. And what we see is that the biggest learning curve or the biggest problem that people have when learning NativeScript right now is the actual user interface portion of it, because that's the one part where if you come from the web, you know HTML, well, that knowledge is mostly useless in NativeScript because there is no div, there is no span, and you really have no choice but to learn our user interface components that we use to sort of, under the hood, create these native UI components. And so when you have people that come to us, that a lot of people, since we're working with Angular 2, a lot of our users are just learning Angular 2. And then when they're trying to learn NativeScript, they're also trying to use our user interface components. And they might also be trying to learn TypeScript as well. And so it can be quite the ramp up for people to have to learn all this stuff, which I would say is the downside. Now, the benefit you get on the other end of that is that once you do get up to speed with these technologies, you can be pretty amazingly productive. And also, since you can share then that knowledge between your web app and your native app, all of a sudden you have the knowledge you need to work on both of these platforms, and you don't have to learn a lot of the things you need to write, say, a truly native iOS app or a truly native Android app. So the ramp up can be quite extreme. I think regardless of any of these stacks that you use nowadays, they're not trivial. But once you get familiar, in theory, the productivity gains should make it worthwhile.
Yeah, I think that, and also I'm sure that NativeScript often gets the same kind of criticism by native developers to the degree where they're like, well, just write it in Java, just write it in Objective C or Swift or such. Do you hear that a lot with NativeScript? We tend to see that a bit in React Native.
Yep, or criticizing JavaScript as a language. It's a toy language that's not suitable for true native developers. Yeah, we hear that a lot, and I think there is some truth to that. I mean, at the end of the day, React Native and NativeScript are both abstractions, and you can certainly do more if you work at the metal. If you're building completely in iOS and Android, no matter how good the React Natives and NativeScripts of the world get, you're always going to be able to build something, slightly better when you're going truly native. But I mean, the value proposition we think we offer is that, we can get you most of the way to that while just making you way more productive by only having to write this thing once.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then, just to tie in with some of that stuff, writing once, right, and kind of taking a look at the advantages that you get as far as like passing on to the client or your product or just the management of code. I'm interested, especially NativeScript coming from that whole Telerik world, and I'm a little bit out of touch with that specifically. But is there, or are there a lot of components or sort of already pre-written pieces and digestible bytes that you can take, sort of like a la the Telerik world, and sort of place them in your code with NativeScript so that you can get up and running once you kind of understand the basic framework? For instance, tables and list views can be complicated per platform, but here inside of React Native, you have one particular style of list view, and it's going to work on both. Is there something similar to that, where you have something that is sort of placeable and modular inside of NativeScript?
Yep, it's very similar in the sense that we have a bunch of UI components that you can sort of drop in, and especially like you said, the history of Telerik, that's really the Telerik's business model for the longest time, is we just make UI components for absolutely everything. And in fact, we make UI components for native iOS and native Android, which is one of the reasons that we had sort of the internal expertise to make something like NativeScript in the first place. And, even to build on top of that, these UI components are also one of the ways that we monetize NativeScript as well. So we have, I think, like 15 or 20 components that you can drop in out of the box, that so things like list view, and then your basic things like label, text box, switch, slider, those sorts of things that are just built into NativeScript. But then we also have a paid package called UI for NativeScript, where we sell charts and graphs and calendars and some of these more premium features that we can offer to our community and say these are written by the same people that design NativeScript itself.
Wow, I love that idea. I think it's like a great way to push development forward. Can you tell us a little bit more about how like UI for NativeScript works? Can it be like a community-driven effort? Is it only folks that work on NativeScript? And is there opportunity to like open up a marketplace to sell more components?
Yeah, so we actually just launched a plugins marketplace. I think it's now at plugins.nativescript.org, because for a while we have a fairly vibrant plugin ecosystem in NativeScript, but we wanted to make it a little bit easier for people to find these things in a consolidated location, which we previously had not done the greatest job with that. Now, right now, it's just lists plugins that are completely free and open source up on GitHub. And we're thinking about in the future opening that up to also having people charge for plugins as well. It's something we might do in the future. With UI for NativeScript in particular, that's just something that we control and also sell. So it's one of the ways that we make back money that goes into the engineering resources for NativeScript. But we do try to build that plugin. We build it using the exact same model that community written plugins use as well. So in a way, that tool helps find problems with our plugin system. We also as a team maintain, I think, something like 5 or 10 of the most commonly requested plugins that don't really have a place in core, but are things that a lot of people need in their apps, things like camera and geolocation and that sort of thing. So in that way, we also sort of verify our plugin model and by using it ourselves and trying to make it as easy to use as possible.
So we already kind of went over Angular a little bit. I'd like to kind of dive deeper into that topic because a lot of our listeners are more React developers, myself included. So as far as Angular 2 is concerned, how has that affected the adoption of NativeScript back when they were not stable versus how it's being adopted now? Can you discuss that for a second?
Yeah. So to take a step back, really, we got started with Angular, I want to say around the time that I was back on this podcast, about 1.5 years ago, maybe even almost 2 years ago. And one of the reasons that got started is NativeScript, when you use it with JavaScript, and we have a lot of people that do that. But one of the complaints we got is that there's a lot of things with NativeScript that you have to learn that are very specific to NativeScript, like how to do data binding, how to do event binding, how to do routing, all of these things that we have our own APIs for. And we had a lot of people that sort of wanted to use a pre-baked solution. And of course, people have different opinions on which one of those to use. Angular in particular was a nice fit for us, both because we already have a history of working as a company with Angular. Our product Kendo UI uses Angular, and we also have Angular 2 components for Kendo UI as well. And also because NativeScript from day one was written in TypeScript. We like to say we were using TypeScript before it was cool to do so. And when Angular switched to TypeScript, that was one of the moments where we realized, like, hey, we might have something here, just because it makes the integration a little bit nicer. Now, moving forward, from an adoption point of view, it was sort of crazy when Angular was still very much a moving target, shipping breaking changes all of the time. But when they released the final version of Angular 2, there was a pretty big sigh of relief for us, at least from an engineering perspective, to hopefully give some stability to that. Now, it sort of at the end of the day, what we offer with NativeScript right now is, from an engineering perspective, maintaining both the ability for people to use JavaScript and Angular is not a huge engineering challenge. Our Angular stuff is just sort of a relatively lightweight layer that sits on top of the main NativeScript core. I mean, most of the code and most of the work on NativeScript goes into our runtimes, like the nitty-gritty that it actually makes it possible to use JavaScript to write apps, to make the communication possible, all those sorts of things. The challenge has been really from both a documentation and messaging perspective, just because lots of times, how do you do routing in NativeScript? Well, there's technically 2 answers to that, because if you're using NativeScript with JavaScript, you do routing one way. If you're doing NativeScript with Angular, then you just do it the Angular way. So that's been the interesting challenge, like figuring out the UX on the docs to how to make that make sense and all that sort of things around it. And then the final thing I'll add is, in terms of adoption, one of the reasons that we do this is our usage as of today is almost exactly 50-50, which is something that's kind of weird, because we have internal debates too, like whether we should prioritize one architectural approach, whether we should just stick with one and consolidate resources, that sort of thing. But our users have consistently told us that we have about equal numbers of people in each camp.
I'd like to ask it. So, just as a question from development here, if I understand correctly, sort of switching gears a little bit, the UX that you get from NativeScript, that's more of the actual native UX that you have, right?
Yes.
Okay. So it's a 2-part question then. One, would you say that sort of affects just sort of how you have to construct each app? So in a pro, it would be that NativeScript would allow you to make things look more native for each particular platform, just by the standard there, because you have to use that native UX. But then second part of the question is, do you feel applications are moving more towards sort of like a universal look and feel across platforms? Or do you still think that iOS apps should look like iOS, Android should have material design and things like that? I'm seeing this sort of being a hot topic when people are sort of creating the experience for apps now. There seems to be a debate. Should it feel like an iOS app for iOS users, or is it now that there's one design and that should feel the same across all devices?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I certainly see the same debate, and we have the same debates internally in terms of what to do as well. And so my stance on this is sort of there's a few core things that I think it really is important to get right, like things like um, how back navigation should work, like the back button on Android should work in your application. On iOS, I really feel like you should be able to sort of swipe to go back. There's some other small user interface things, like sort of the nature of the app, that I think is worth respecting. But the actual user interface, I think more and more, like if you think about some of the main apps that you use on your phone, so many of them just completely, they might care about how buttons look, but they don't necessarily have to use the UI navigation bar or some of these other built-in interface things, and they just sort of plug their own or sort of create their own ecosystem, which is certainly easier, especially if you're using a cross-platform tool. In fact, with NativeScript, one of the more challenging things that we deal with is making those sorts of things work in a cross-platform way. Like we have a action bar UI component, for instance. It's one of the ones that we provide out of the box, and it's a wrapper around the UI navigation bar for iOS, and I forget the exact API we wrap on Android. But it's tricky because those two things work quite a bit differently in terms of the recommendations in terms of, well, where are your buttons supposed to go? Like, are they supposed to go on the left? Are they supposed to go on the right? Should you use an icon in that thing? How the coloring should work? Should they have a shadow? All these sorts of things is tricky for us to deal with as a framework. So it's certainly easier for us if people just say, well, I don't need that. I'm just going to completely create my own thing. So, I mean, as a framework, we sort of feel like it's not necessarily, we can have recommendations, but we want to enable people to build with either approach. So we try to provide these things so that you can still use our cross-platform UI components where they make sense, and you can just abandon them where they don't make sense. So we feel like our place is really as an enabler of either of those situations. We try to stay more low level in that regard, but it is still important, like in terms of, people a lot of times look to frameworks to sort of have they just want to know how to do it, right? Like we see a lot of developers, especially coming from the web, just saying they just want to be told, here's how you app. And they don't necessarily want to get into all this various design discussions and such.
Yeah, I find that it has to be a while in mobile before it's just how to do it well is the question after how to do it is the question, right?
Yep.
So true. Sorry, I don't mean to monopolize. I know that everybody else has questions, but I want to ask, one of the things that I'm really interested in is sort of that developer experience that happens. So when you're working with this, and as somebody just from the outside, I've worked with Native, I worked with Ruby Motion, and I worked with React Native. I haven't had a chance to work with NativeScript. And one of the things that's sort of really important to me is that developer experience when you are having somebody new or you're going after something new. There's some really neat things that I've seen. Obviously, hot reloading is a great concept. And then, now we have live reloading and just, we have live and then we had hot. Yeah. So one of the things I'm interested in is like, what's the experience? Are you having to go through recompiling for each change, adding on that extra native framework? Are you seeing large compile times? Is it like run this command, then go eat lunch and come back? Is there any like gotchas or super amazing experiences for the developer in using NativeScript that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I'm sort of the same way. Like I want these things to be as simple as possible. So to answer your first question, we don't require recompilation at every change that you make. So your basic workflow is the NativeScript CLI is a called TNS. It's the TNS command on the CLI. So you would do TNS create name of my app. You'd CD into that directory, and then you would run TNS run either iOS or Android, which would actually compile the app the first time. It'll launch it up on a simulator or emulator by default. It'll launch it on a USB connected device if you've got one of those plugged in, and then it'll automatically watch for changes. And after you change your app, it'll do what we call a live sync that essentially just ports over the sort of changed code and refreshes it on the fly. So in that sense, it's somewhat similar to how React Native works, or at least the last time that I worked with React Native. Now, I will say, if I'm completely honest, that React Native set the bar quite high here. And in fact, when I use React Native, that's the one thing that still amazes me to this day is just how smooth that process is. And so again, if I'm honest, I think NativeScript, we're playing a little bit of catch up from this perspective. I think we've got that starting experience where it's really simple to build an app, really simple to watch. I think that works really well. The one thing that we're working on right now is specifically with Angular, when you sync over, say, a TypeScript file change, we don't hot reload that. We don't reload it on the fly. So we don't force a complete native recompilation, right? So you don't have to go through that process. But we still we'll ship over that TypeScript. We'll compile the TypeScript code. We'll ship over the compiled JavaScript code, but then we'll restart your application up. So there is a little bit of sync. It's not like the file sort of changes on the fly, and so that's something that we're looking at adding in terms of some hot reload capabilities. The other thing too is from a debugging experience, where I think React Native really sets the bar quite high. Now we have things like step debugging. We have a step debugger. You can use it with the Chrome developer tools. We have integration with Visual Studio Code as well, so you can step debug directly within Visual Studio Code, sort of even with TypeScript and Angular apps that we like quite a bit. But one thing that we're trying to add right now is sort of making the elements panel of the developer tools work, so you can sort of mess around with the visual tree, inspect it, make changes on the fly, that sort of thing. And the other one would be performance monitoring as well. I think React Native has some pretty good tooling around making that possible. And we have some of that, but it's sort of available in third-party plugins, and it's not something that's just baked into our core developer tools. So that's something that we're looking on adding as well.
Very cool. Thank you.
So TJ, what should we expect in the future for NativeScript? What are your thoughts for the roadmap and things to come?
Yeah, so a couple things that we're working on. A lot of them are related to performance. When we look at NativeScript right now, we spent a lot of time over the last few months optimizing our performance at runtime, and we think that we've done a pretty good job there. That at runtime, we're sufficiently fast for the majority of apps that people want to build. But one thing that we certainly need to improve is how fast that our applications start up. And so particularly on Android, and particularly when using Angular, load times with NativeScript can fall into a handful of seconds, 2 or 3 seconds to load up. And it's something that a lot of our users want to see improved, and we want to improve as well. Now, the good news for that is Angular, I guess one of the reasons our apps are slow is because when a NativeScript app starts up, we have to sort of register all your JavaScript with the JavaScript virtual machine that we're using to actually drive your application. And once Angular is involved, that can get quite large. Angular is not known for being the world's smallest framework. But the good news is Angular is extremely toolable. So it was designed with TypeScript and with a number of other things so that you can do sort of like AOT compilation, and Webpack is really well. There's some really good Webpack plugins for sort of reducing the size, tree shaking, all of these various things that you can do that we're only leveraging a small portion of that in NativeScript today. So we want to be smarter about only including the JavaScript that you are using in your actual app package, which will drastically reduce loading times on Android and such. And we have some of that today. You can use Webpack with NativeScript, but we want to make it a lot smarter to decrease those load times quite a bit. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, really debugging things and improving our tooling there. So really making it easier to find and spot performance issues in your apps and building some tooling around that, making it easier to work with the visual tree in NativeScript and sort of change things on the fly. And really, those are the two main things that we're going to be focusing on over the next few months here.
That's awesome news to hear. Hey, is there a way to debug network requests in NativeScript? Like, let's say I know that might be a little tricky because you're using underlying components, native components to make that happen. But can you give us any insight on if that's possible today or if it can be possible in the future?
So that's another thing that's on our list. It can be possible. We think we can put it into the same debugging tools that we're using for step debugging and such. So we think we can add that sort of thing, and it's on our list. Right now, it's not possible other than the same tools that you would use for completely native iOS or Android development.
No problem. Cool. That's exciting that it's on the roadmap.
So are you aware of any kind of large companies or projects that have adopted NativeScript or kind of taking a serious look at it at this point?
Yeah, so if you're curious, you can go to nativescript.org/showcases, where we talk about some of these apps and we show logos, and you can check out some of these apps that are out on the App Store. Now, one of the things that is tricky for working with a large company is I have to be careful about certain things that I mentioned, especially some of these companies that we have enterprise support deals. I don't know if I can particularly mention some of them. I know we've got like companies like Kiva that we've worked with, Fidelity that we've worked with. Let's see, what are some of the other ones that I can mention? I think you're better
Wrangle.io, Keyzen, GFT. I'm just looking at the showcases list. I'm assuming you can bring those up.
Yep. Yeah, those are good ones. Those are typically the big names. But like I said, a lot of our enterprise support deals are ones that are happening for apps that are being built behind closed doors, a lot of apps that will never see the public app stores anyways. We do a lot of business with those types of companies, just as progress as a company. That's just traditionally the way we've worked.
If you're a NativeScript developer, are there any resources or a website we could view to help find jobs that are looking for other NativeScript developers?
At the moment, I do not know of such a thing. There is some overlap with Angular. We see ourselves popping up a lot on Angular job listings, but there's none specifically for NativeScript at the moment.
So for someone that wants to kind of start becoming a developer and building mobile apps with NativeScript, what are the bottom line requirements for someone, in your opinion, that would be able to get up and running efficiently? And what, skills should they possess? Should they understand TypeScript, or is that not 100% something they should know? And I guess those types of questions. And also, any learning resources for people that do want to get up to speed with NativeScript.
Yeah, so anybody that just sort of wants to use NativeScript, if you go to nativescript.org and click the Get Started button, there's two different tutorials that we maintain on the NativeScript documentation. One for using NativeScript with JavaScript, one for using NativeScript with TypeScript and Angular. And the tutorials are fairly thorough. They'll take you easily a good day to go through. We try to make them fairly comprehensive to give you an official way of getting up to speed with NativeScript. So anybody that's interested, I'd encourage you to go through those. Now, in terms of background knowledge, if you know some JavaScript and CSS, you'll be able to get going with NativeScript. You don't necessarily have to know TypeScript. You don't have to know Angular. But the more, I'd say, familiar you are with certain native concepts, like things like how you work with iOS simulators, or how Android AVDs work, or how the Android and iOS ecosystem works, those things will help you be successful with React. Well, with NativeScript, and I also imagine React Native as well. And we try to teach you some of those things as you go through with NativeScript. But if you have existing experience in those worlds, you're certainly going to be far better off in the long run.
Okay, well, I guess we'll go ahead and get to the picks. Peter, do you have any picks today?
Yes. So my pick is Marxico. and it's markc.co. If you're a fan of Evernote like I am, and you hate the fact that they don't support Markdown, and more specifically being able to add like code comment or whatever, Markco is a Markdown editor that'll automatically sync your notes to Evernote. It's been awesome. It's a paid thing, but right now he's doing a special at $16 for the entire year, which I personally believe is very worth it.
Okay, Kent, do you have any picks?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to completely butcher his name. Satyajit Sahu. Everybody knows who I'm talking about. It's Satya164. He's probably merged a lot of your pull requests if you've done anything for React Native. He just did a blog article called Type Checking React and Redux with Flow. And so sorry to bring up Flow, obviously, while we have NativeScript on the line. I know there's hard feelings there. But so just to kind of bring in there that it's difficult to choose, what you want to do to go ahead and help with type checking. And it's a great article to sort of bring you in. It's a part 1 of 2. And I'm going to go ahead and link you up in the docs here. But fantastic way to go ahead and start taking a look at whether or not you should be using Flow inside of any React Native project. Okay.
TJ, do you have any picks?
Yeah, so I'll pick Pokemon Sun. So I'm going to go full nostalgia here. I was a giant fan of the Pokemon series. I first played Pokemon Red on my black and green Game Boy way back in the day. And so with Pokemon Go coming out, and my kids are now sort of old enough to start to get into this world, the Pokemon world, I've decided a while ago to pick up Pokemon Sun and sort of relive that experience. And for the last couple of weeks, I've been in complete and utter nostalgia mode, just sort of reliving my childhood. So it's a pretty fun game if you played the Pokemon games years ago, or if you've played them fairly recently. It's sort of a fun game to go through. So highly recommended.
Nice.
All right. Well, my pick is a book. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this book before. I don't think I have, but if I have, I apologize. It's Abundance. The Future is Better Than You Think. I started it recently, so I know it was something I meant to pick one day. So if I have not, here it is. Anyway, it's about kind of an examination of data and kind of a contrarian view of how the world is at this point versus maybe what you have heard in the media, or maybe more like a very factual overview of how we're kind of living in maybe the most prosperous time in the history of the world. And it also is a very positive view of kind of how technology has improved certain parts of agriculture and how that's affecting things. Bottom line, it's just a really, really interesting book. So if you're looking for something to read, it's called Abundance. The Future is Better Than You Think, and it's written by Peter Diamandis. So yeah, check it out. Okay, well, that wraps up episode 54 of React Native Radio. TJ, thank you for coming on again.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
And we'll see everyone next week.